Dr. Compton leaned in, his voice tense as he asked the author, "Just how depraved does your philosophy professor villain become in defense of his psychopathic beliefs?" The author, Brian Godawa, takes a deep breath, anticipating a lengthy answer to describe his compelling intellectual thriller of darkness and apologetics. Well, that was my attempt at leading with narrative. But really, Dr. Compton is about to have this very conversation. Welcome to MarsCast, a podcast from Mid-America Reformed Seminary, where our faculty members address all things theological and cultural from a Reformed lens. I'm your host, Jared Luchabor. In today's episode, Dr. Compton sits down with Brian Godawa, celebrated novelist and author. Their conversation dives into Godawa's creative process in narrative storytelling and his unique approach of intertwining apologetics and a defense of the Christian faith, particularly in the gripping tale he wrote called Cruel Logic, which is about a psychopathic philosophy professor. It was a fascinating conversation to sit in on and to listen to. Check it out.
Well, it's good to be here with our guest, Brian Godawa. Brian, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
Yeah, this is great. We've been talking a bit about fiction, about storytelling in previous episodes, and just the use of that genre for teaching the Christian faith, defending the Christian faith, which for some people just seems like such an odd thing to do. But what's so great by having Brian on board here today is here is a writer who has done that very thing in a number of different volumes. So we're really excited to just talk with you about the use of fiction, the use of storytelling, in your case too, movie writing, movie scripts, in defending the faith, in teaching the faith, promoting Christian values. How did you become a writer? How did you get into this?
Well, I've always been an artist, but I started out more as a visual artist when I was younger, and I had always sort of been an artist in that sense. And when I became a Christian, I went to college, and but I also was in love with television and the movies. And when I became a Christian, I actually, and when I, there's a time in my life where I didn't quite understand how to integrate my Christian faith, my new Christian faith at the time, with my artistic temperament and interests and loves. But I was definitely drawn to the movies. And of course, it's many, many years ago, but still, I'd always loved them because I could see how powerful they were emotionally to me and psychologically and deeply. But when I became a Christian and I read Francis Schaeffer, who was a very famous theologian from the 70s, and reading his work was what began to help me understand the nature of worldview and how your faith integrates with your art, because of course he really focused a lot on the arts and drew from artists and history and such to try to explain it. And it really, and actually then, so the whole Labrie collective, including Udo Middleman, which was actually, he was in some ways more helpful because he wrote the first art history survey from a Christian worldview perspective that helped me understand my world. So my love for movies is what drew me into the drama of it. I did street drama in college for gospel skits and stuff like that because I just loved it. But by the time I graduated, I had decided that I wanted to pursue filmmaking kind of on the side as I had my daily life and career going, and my love for movies just drew me into it. And I was discipled by a Christian filmmaker of that day when almost nobody made Christian movies, and they're very, very hard to get out there. But he actually discipled me in terms of another step towards how to integrate that faith with art, and particularly with storytelling,
Sure.
And then from that point on, I just began studying storytelling on my own. And, it came around year 2000 or so where I finally got my first movie made. And that was To End All Wars in 2001, starring Kiefer Sutherland. And that was a true story based on POWs in World War II in a Japanese imprisonment camp. And and that was the sort of breakthrough for me that started shifting my focus from not just the visual arts, but also to storytelling, and then in 2011, about thereabouts, I started my novel writing career, which was sort of, inspired by the difficulty that I was having in Hollywood, because it's tough to get movies made. It's almost impossible. And so, I just was stretching out and trying to figure out how else I can get my stories out there, because it was very difficult to get stories made. And, artist wants to share with the world, what we see and such. And that changed my life really dramatically, because my novels started exploding and selling really well. And that's where I am today, where I write mostly novels. I do some occasional movies on the side, but mostly I'm focusing on that as my storytelling. And it's mostly novels and fiction. But what I do is, because of who I am and the kinds of things I'm interested in, I've written mostly Bible novels, which is sort of retelling Bible stories, and bringing in, sort of pulling back the veil of the supernatural world. And so there's angels and demons and stuff like that. So, it's speculative, and I draw from ancient Jewish traditions and ancient Christian traditions that are not necessarily in the Bible, but they sort of bring some of this, as they retell the Bible stories, they also invest some of their own stories and such into it. So I draw from a lot of the ancient world and the ancient world context in order to retell those biblical stories, trying to remain true to the Bible, but also filling in between the gaps with fiction that will be consistent with what we do know from the Bible. And but then also it's bringing on, it's communicating some definite perspectives on the Bible that are kind of I don't know. It could be considered controversial, maybe.
Yeah, you're not your typical Sunday school versions of some of the stories in a way. Yeah, and I'm thinking of, for example, that some of your Nephilim novels, right? I think you're very much utilizing a lot of what Michael Heiser, the late Michael Heiser, had spelled out. Interestingly, I'll talk with students. I teach Old Testament here. Chiefly, and we'll talk about Genesis 6 sometimes, and sort of the debates in history over the nature of the Nephilim, the nature of the giants. And it's interesting how there's even someone like Willem van Gemeren, who taught for many years out here at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, has written from a Reformed Presbyterian perspective on the I think he called it evangelical anti-supernaturalism, when talking about just how the dare I say again, the Sunday school version of that kind of whitewashes a whole range of possibilities. Now, again, I'm not trying to nail down a definition on the Nephilim, but what's cool is to see how easy it is to get yourself in a very narrow interpretive box in thinking about Noah, or in thinking about Enoch, or so it's a really cool thing to do.
If I can explain, that's a great example of how fiction is used to fill out or to speculate, but it can be done. There's still many Christians who just don't get it. They just think it's blasphemous. They think, I just have the Bible. That's all I need. And look, I understand if you don't care as much for fiction, but when you start attacking it, you're really going down a bad path. Because, for example, Noah's a good example. We don't really know much about Noah. We hear about the event, we hear about the flood and a little bit before, but we don't really know anything. There's a few statements about him, and but perfect example of this is, classic traditional image is this old man with his Sunday school animals walking up in the ark,
smiling.
Yeah, and he's a farmer or an agrarian. But if you look at the scriptures, it says that the world was filled with violence. Yeah. And evil was perpetually on every thought of man's heart. So it makes sense for you to conclude, well, to be a godly man in that world and to be able to survive in a world full of violence, you probably have to be a warrior, actually.
Yeah.
And so I made him a tribal warrior leader, but we don't know anything about him. So as long as it's consistent with that general sort of notion of what's going on in the scriptures, then I think it helps you see afresh with fresh eyes. Well, even Abraham, people, again, another character that you just think of, he's this nomadic, gentle guy or whatever. But no, I mean, he led a bunch of warriors after, hundreds of warriors. Yeah. And got back his son Lot. And so they're warriors too. Abraham was a warrior. So these are the kind of things that I try to be true to scripture, but sometimes unveil a fresh take that people may not have seen, but is consistent with the Bible and is possible.
Yeah, absolutely. When did you started talking about how you made the switch to novel writing? Is that about when you started kind of using that medium for sort of this I don't want to call it just Bible teaching or apologetics teaching, but making this actual presentation of biblical content, yes, imaginative, although in the sense of apologetics, you're making a case for the Christian faith. Is that approximately when you started doing that, when you started doing the novels? Yeah,
well, I've always, in terms of all my storytelling from the very beginning, even in movies and stuff, has always been driven by a Christian worldview. And understanding how that applies to your art is something we'll need to talk about. But But what launched me into writing novels was I was actually forced into it because I actually had I came up with this great idea of a Bible story that Hollywood could make because it has enough fantastic nature, the ancient world and swords and all that. But it would also be the Bible, so Christians and Jews would love. And that was the story of Noah. And that was where I started to discover about the Nephilim and look into that and say, wow, there's a lot more to this than I realized. And it's exciting. And it's a fresh theological thread in the Bible that I didn't see was there. And it's not different from Orthodox Christianity. It just fills it out a little bit more.
Yeah.
But my point was, I wanted to, I'm like, this is it. This is be cool. This is my unique contribution in Hollywood because I could be the best Bible writer, for Bible movies or whatever. But then I discovered Darren Aronofsky was making his movie Noah, and I thought, oh well, I don't have a chance then because I was a little guy with no connections, and it made me go, I want to get my story out though because it was so powerful and deep, and I thought, well, I guess I should put it out as a novel. I've been wanting to do novels eventually. And that was the thing that I didn't realize, when it did so well. And then I looked, as I studied it more, I realized there's a lot more here, a lot more stories for me to tell. And it was just basically me following the opportunities that God gave me. God gave me more opportunities with my novels than with movies. And so I just followed that. And he's blessed it with a lot of success.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's I've just been reading through the work of Daniel Silliman, who has surveyed a number of Christian novels produced over the last several decades, and showing how the publishing industry has even had to move back and forth in accommodating those novels. But it's interesting to see how in each of the cases of the books he looks at, one of them is The Shack. I know some debate about the evangelical nature of that because it carries some real problematic Trinitarian formulations.
Exactly.
However, just as an example of a book that's attempting to write of the Christian faith in a fiction genre, or This Present Darkness by Peretti, right? He goes through a number of these, some of Jeanette Oakes' works, but in each of those cases notes the power of storytelling to inculcate worldview, and that's exactly what we have going on here. I mean, we just see this that fiction storytelling is a very powerful catechetical tool. So much so that Jerry Jenkins and Left Behind, Tim LaHaye. That's it, Jared Mouth. Tim LaHaye to me, right? Tim LaHaye was starting off with nonfiction presentations of premillennial dispensationalism, but it was when he started employing a storytelling idiom or medium that this thing went completely gangbusters. And now, how many millions of people have been learning about premillennial dispensationalism through these novels?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so this is the big doorway, the portal into understanding the nature of art and faith and such. And so there's a few issues to be dealt with here. I've written about it in my book, The Imagination of God. That's where I developed my aesthetic. Was also in my book, Hollywood Worldviews, which was explaining storytelling in particular and how storytelling itself incarnates redemption and how it affects the viewers and such. But in those books, I point out that, well, if you want to be biblical about it, God uses about 70 or about, I don't know, maybe 20, 30% at most in terms of propositional truth in the Bible. And about 70 to 80% is actually story, poetry, imagery, imagination. And so storytelling in general is, of course, the big picture for the Bible. And so in a very real sense, and look, Jesus used parables. I mean, the power of parables to get into a person's heart and soul. It begins with, there's different components of art. As I speak, primarily as a storyteller, but of course it applies to other art as well. Art is a sort of a tangible embodiment of the ideas, but specifically drama and storytelling, the power of it, I think, lies in the fact that it is incarnation. Yeah. And in the same way that Jesus was the incarnate Word, the Word became flesh, right? You've got an ultimate equivalency in the nature of Christ himself, where he's both equally God and man, and he's both equally the eternal Logos, the underlying order of the universe, and who is God, and as well as the embodiment of that God on earth. And so the power of story is that it incarnates ideas, and ideas can, this is not to denigrate rationality or ideas. Ideas are powerful. I love ideas. I've always loved philosophy and such, but it's not as widespread. A lot of people have a harder time. They don't like the intellectualizing. They don't like, or they can't get into the in-depth abstract thinking. It's a lot more difficult for most people, but everybody can enjoy a good story. Right. And I argue the reason why is because story embodies or it incarnates ideas or worldviews. And in my book, Hollywood Worldviews, I explain how that works, how that plays out through the story of the protagonist. And as you follow his journey, you're drawn into him, into his journey, and you learn with that character what they learn. And of course, there's power because it can, of course, emotions can manipulate, but so can logic. So, the most manipulative books in the world are, logical treatises written by Marx, Darwin, Freud, so everything can manipulate. And that's the thing most people don't realize. They tend to think that the, emotional manipulation has to do more with imagination and creativity, but it really doesn't. But needless to say, we, created in the image of God, we are both rational creatures and imaginative creatures. And I just think that evangelicalism in particular, that's more my tradition. I don't think Catholicism has the problem that Protestants have.
Yeah, certainly not with Hans Urs von Balthasar's, theodrama unpacking that dramatical.
And I mean, there's mode. Idolatry involved in there, but there's also the notion that Protestants tend to be afraid of images because of their respect for the second commandment. I get that, but it's misaligned in my opinion. But anyway, I'm getting off topic here. The point is incarnation, and so story incarnates ideas. So you can have an abstract logical argument and say, you're a worldview, you're a humanist. You believe that, man is the measure of all things, but I'm a Christian. Without God as a proper foundation for your thinking, you have no, we can engage in abstract argumentation, which is good, and that's part of who we are. But what appeals more to people is to see a story where you see the humanist living out his life in comparison with the Christian living out their lives. And both are not perfect, both have problems, etc. But ultimately, a story is in a sense, it is the incarnation of worldviews in competition colliding, and the conclusion of that story, the worldview that wins is the worldview that is more desirable in a very simplistic sort of way of describing it.
Yeah,
but it's very important for me at this point, as I'm trying to describe, this is how the power of storytelling works. Part of my own Christian journey, as a conservative Christian and a Reformed Christian as well, is this understanding that the reason why so much Christian art does fail is because it elevates the message over the craft. In other words, well, the message is everything. People got to get saved. And so, but when you value the message over the craft, then that's where you get the preachiness. You don't understand you don't really, when you see art as a tool, that's when you fail. The fact is, all art embodies worldview. So it's not a question of is it a tool or not? It just is. It just does. It embodies truth and worldview from the perspective of the storyteller or the artist. But when you see it as a tool, the purpose of telling the story, N.T. Wright has mentioned this, when you sit there and you try to explain, well, the meaning behind the Good Samaritan, and then you just toss aside the parable because now you have the meaning, you've completely missed the whole point. It's the story itself that embodies the meaning in a way that you cannot dissect intellectually or through propositional truth. There's a rational side to it, sure, and you can discuss it, obviously. But by going through that journey with the Good Samaritan, you do actually come into connection with truth in a way that rationality cannot bring you.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, for me as an artist, I think that I began to transcend and my whatever preachiness or sort of bad, I don't know what you'd call it, but yeah, just the preachiness of bad Christian art and all that kind of stuff. When I elevated the craft to equal ultimacy with the message, because I see story as in and of itself good from God. And so I do not ever want to tell a story that's not entertaining, that does not, emotionally draw a person, or I won't write a scene just for the sake of getting information across. I try to, every scene I write, every element has to be engaged with emotions, with, thoughts, with personalities and redemption and character arcs and everything.
Sure.
And so because I value the art itself, and that's why, but I mean, Christians aren't the only ones guilty of that. I mean, all propaganda does that. I mean, technically,
no doubt.
There's a lot, as we know now, the wokeism in Hollywood, we're seeing how, it's destroying storytelling because their message is becoming more important than the story. Yeah. And so that's why, people are pulling away in droves, and because they're doing, the woke have become the new bad Christian art, bad woke art.
Yeah, interesting.
So there.
What an irony, right?
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
and what I think is so valuable not just for our listeners, but for all people to remember is, I think you do this really well in the imagination of God. You're pointing out it's not less than propositions. It's propositions or it's more than propositions. Certainly, Scripture it predicates truths of God in a very immediate kind of way.
Yes.
But we have imagination. We have images. I mean, you mentioned the parables of Jesus. I'm struck that Nathan's already speaking parables to King David. And you just have such a vividness in again, that embodiedness that gives story that power. I can remember several decades ago being at a meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society and listening to some speakers who were trying to make a case for something akin to the Reformed biblical theology of Gerhardus Voss and Herman Ritterboss that many on sort of the continental and Reformed and Presbyterian side have been very used to. But for some evangelicals, the idea of a sort of historical unfolding of revelation is so new and treated so with such suspect. Whereas on the Protestant side, there's been a lot of deep reflection on these very points. For many years, which makes, again, you interact with Kevin Van Hooser pretty substantially. In this book, I studied with Michael Horton at Westminster Seminary out west, that he was engaged in some of the same kinds of conversations about this dramatic mode to God's revelation. And when we pull that out, it becomes so almost silly. I mean, you point out, you have a great line in the imagination of God, just about, look, theological jargon's not wrong, it's valuable, but we can't let theological shorthand overshadow or replace biblical longhand. And then what's neat for our readers, Brian has a chart, right? I'm all about charts here at the seminary. The students always pick on me. I say the dispensationalists can't have all the charts. We need to claim charts. But your chart, you've got omnipotence, omnipresence, omniscience, all these traditional attributes paired, though, with the way the Bible talks about that. It's exactly what we need to be reminded of, not to let our commitment to the clear teaching of God's word about who God is in these sort of propositional forms, we can't let that mute the inherent drama, the inherent just power and vividness of the way the story comes to us.
Well, I've always loved theology and philosophy and apologetics, so I've loved and enjoyed the value of technical language, because it does simplify conversations and get you to the point, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality of the world around me has forced me to really embrace the fact that most people don't. Yeah. And I'm sorry, but most people just can't follow theology. They just, and maybe they should, you could argue that they should be better with it. They should think more, whatever. I always loved R.C. Sproul, because he was the one who would challenge the mind, but he would do it I called him the working man's theologian, because, he would do it in like a, New York type accent, but also he would simplify in a way that could make people understand, but then challenge them to lift their minds a little bit more. But that reality is what makes me go, okay, I love the theological and even some of the scholarly language in the talk. I get it, but most people don't. And I want to bring this to the people, because I believe it's valuable and I believe it is important, but I can't, I can't do it through just more theological language. So I do see the value of storytelling in that sense, where, in fact, it's kind of interesting, because from decades I studied a lot of stuff that's theological and weird, and I often felt like, since I wasn't a big teacher in churches, I would do some teaching here and there, but I had studied a lot for a lot of years, that just out of my love for it, and I would sit there and wonder, like, boy, there's so much I've learned, and most Christians just aren't open to even talking about this stuff, Well, with my novels, basically, I've drawn from all that stuff that I could never communicate. It's all in my novels now. And normal people are reading it and ingesting it, and maybe they're not, I don't know, maybe they're realizing it, maybe they're not, but God has finally used all that theological stuff that I studied, and now I'm actually, in some ways, it's like, my novels are they're not my systematic theology, but they're my, whatever the word you would call it, but they are the way of communicating theology, which is the study of God, right? It's just, it's about revealing God's nature to people. And so I'm grateful for that, but it's that balance between, the quest for depth and clarity that philosophy and theology brings, but also that chasm that exists between the normal man, who can't as readily pick that stuff up. And so how do you communicate that, So.
Well, and it strikes me, right? You're some of us are we're going to happily pick up one of Van Til's books on defending the faith, or we're happily going to read through Schaeffer. I've been thinking about Old Testament stuff. We're going to dig into Heiser, and even all the secondary literature that Michael Heiser has been invoking in his writings. We're going to be just plenty happy looking into that. Yeah. But there's a whole host of people who won't. They're maybe not wired for that. They're lazy. There could be good reasons, or can be negative reasons. But why just leave them then? Why keep browbeating them? You need to read more theology books. Which, I got to be careful there, because we want people to read more theology books.
Yeah,
right.
But
exactly. Why do that and not give them something like, I'm just going to pull cruel logic out now. Here is a story where you're assuming probably your reader is not going to pull out Van Til's Defense of the Faith. But you can still show them the folly of unbelief. Yeah. And you can grip them now with a thriller, with a horror story, And at the same time, as they're pouring through it, now they're seeing unbelief play out for all the folly and destruction and ugliness that unbelief has.
Yeah, but also, like you bring up the apologetics angle of it. So in a sense, I call my book narrative apologetics.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that I set out to write this book where I'm going to do my apologetics and just put it in a different form? No,
Mm-hmm.
actually, the idea itself was very intriguing to me because it did embody the moral argument for the existence of God better than any rational argument I've ever heard. And what that is the premise of Cruel Logic is that there's a brilliant serial killer on a woke university campus. And he captures university professors and he debates with them. And the topic of his debate is his moral right to kill them. So he'll have an evolutionary biologist or a queer theorist, and he'll say, okay, if what you teach your students about reality is true, give me one logically valid reason why I should not kill you, and I'll let you go. Needless to say, they don't do very well. But the reason why, that scenario is like a parable, and I actually had heard of it decades earlier from an old Christian apologist named Walter Martin. He's the guy who wrote Kingdom of the Cults.
Yep.
And
Bible
he was a
Answer
rascally
Man.
fun...
the original Bible Answer Man, right?
Yeah, he was, yeah. And I just loved the guy, and he was rascally and he had a good sense of humor and all. But I remember, hearing him on a Long John Nebel show from the 60s on a cassette tape, right? And he was arguing with the atheist, and he's trying to get the atheist to realize, you believe in morality, but you don't have a foundation for it. Yes, I do. And he finally got so frustrated, he said, okay, look, it's 1940s Germany. I'm a Nazi with a gun pointed at you and you're a Jew. Give me one reason why I shouldn't kill you. And that never, and it really stopped the atheist short. And I never forgot that, obviously, because that's the premise of Cruel Logic. And it's not just a gimmick. I mean, it really is. Whenever I hear good apologists and particularly presuppositionalists, argue with atheists, it is amazing how completely ignorant and unaware atheists are of their own thinking. They think, but they don't think about their thinking, and their responses to what the presuppositional apologists are saying just shows they don't even know what they're talking about. They've not even thought about the reality that their moral system is completely arbitrary. They have no foundation to argue for anything that's objectively transcendently good or evil. And they don't, and it's so funny, but it just shows the frustration that you have when you see this truth and this reality that without God, all is permissible. And Dostoevsky was right. And I actually quote Dostoevsky in my book because I think Dostoevsky's, argument with Ivan and Alyosha in The Brothers Karamazov is the best form of the moral argument for the existence of God in history. So far better than many of the philosophical arguments I've heard, because it really connects. Every time you read it, it really hits you to your soul, and you hear and you feel both sides of the equation. And so when the gospel is brought in, that Christ is the one who suffered for you on your behalf, it's just profound, So so I actually brought that in my novel as well, because in the story I have a cop and a psychologist who's kind of like a Jordan Peterson character, to be honest. He's a teacher who teaches Western civilization at the school, and they're, the woke college is against him, and they're trying to track down this killer. And that character, the psychologist, is going through his own struggle of a journey because, he rejects his Jewish past, and yet he's sitting there defending Western civilization, which is founded on the Judeo-Christian principles. And that's an irony that he's being forced to face as he's interacting with this serial killer who's in a way making an argument to the people who are trying to track him down. So there's that whole component going on there as well. And which is why the theme of Cruel Logic or one of the major themes is ideas have consequences.
Yeah.
And that's another famous R.C. Sproul line that also comes from actually I can't remember the guy's name, back in the 50s or whatever. He came up with that phrase. But the idea is that I see that no matter how removed academia is with its ivory tower and all that, they are the source of a lot of the dramatic change in culture, because they are, by and large, godless collectives that are just brewing their own antichrist philosophy, and it's all academic, and so people don't know about it. But then students come to school, they're taught that it's garbage, and then they go out into the world and get jobs, and they bring the evil ideologies with them, and that's what changes the culture, and that's why we are where we are today. Yeah. Yes, there are many factors, but that's a large one that we now see as the cover's been blown from higher education, and how it is like completely captured by this woke leftist postmodernism Marxism, and it's just so I wanted to wrestle with that reality as well, because there's a lot of people who don't really know the details of what's going on in modern universities. And of course, there's varieties. They're not all the same, but but certainly most public colleges and such are like this. And so I drew from actual real events that have occurred in the last 5 or 10 years on college campuses. So everything that occurs in my novel, that whether it's the student protests or sex week that they have on campuses, it's all based on real stuff.
That's
really happening.
It's funny you bring that up, because that blew my mind when I saw that. And for our listeners too, here's a novel with footnotes. And that is so interesting that so often you're tapping back into to news stories, to journal reports, to statements from universities. Yeah. And that's exactly what you're able to illustrate through this narrative mode. I found as well. I mean, the main kind of debate seems to be taking place with the serial killer, and then the professor and the cop. Interestingly named Cornelius Van Til, but hopefully our listeners will grin about that.
There's only a few.
I loved even how he's from Midwestern Theological Seminary University. I went, well, we got to have him on here at Mid-America Reformed Seminary. So but you also though have, in the little dialogue between you got this freshman boy deconstructing his faith, Danny, and then you got the girl a little older than him, Shavonda, who is teaching him all the ins and outs of critical race theory. Yeah. And normally, critical race theory, these kinds of woke things are playing out in little 15-second TikTok clips. But finally, in their little subplot, you're able to kind of illustrate the absurdity. It made me just laugh out loud a number of times to watch her spouting off all these sound bites that sound really good on TikTok. But when suddenly they're placed into an actual dialogue, they start breaking apart as just sounding really tone deaf and absurd. Yeah. I mean, even when he decides, well, I'm gonna become transracial. Well, shoot, now I'm giving a spoiler here to people. But unpacking the logic behind that, and watching her, as they say now, boy, she says the quiet part out loud quite a bit. Yeah. And, I wanted to also, so I kind of make her actually a little bit cynical. She's a person who has realized what the system is, and she kind of knows it's a scam, but she's using it for her own advancement, And since she likes Danny, she's willing to let him in on and sort of teach him the ways, because in truth, I think anyone with intelligence can see it's a fraud. So the people who are promoting it are only doing it because they want to control power. They want to have power. They want to take power away from people. And by the way, again, we're not going to give a lot away, but one of my big arguments is all this woke stuff that we see. There's a reason why their language is so extreme, right? Like if you're a conservative or a Republican, you're a Nazi, you're a Hitler, decolonizing, they promote decolonizing, and they believe decolonizing allows for violence. The bottom line of this is it's an ideology that's driven
purely by power, because there is no ultimate good or evil. So they're going to do anything to get power, and it ultimately leads to violence. And that's the goal. That's where this is leading. And we see it actually, when we see students now rising up, and how many, 50% of them, supporting genocide of Jews. Oh, yeah. It's like publicly. That's what was happening in Germany before the Holocaust. The public would actually be publicly against Jews, and I would never have imagined that would ever get to that point in America. Yep. And yet here we now are, and it's the students who are doing that. And then it's no surprise that then they are the ones who have the protests that end in violent riots, right? Mm-hmm. And Antifa and BLM, they're all oriented towards violence, because that's what they're in their heart of hearts, that's the philosophy. The ideology is an ideology of violence and hatred. Mm-hmm. And so but it's disguised as one of compassion, inclusion, and diversity and equity, but it's actually about violence. And I want to, that brings me to the next thing that I know you were going to talk about this, but I think it kind of, leads to this. For Christians need to be aware, this is a harsh novel. This is not, this is not, some Christians have been just shocked and offended, because in the novel I have the F-bomb, because students use that language excessively in the real world. And the truth is this gets down to my philosophy and my aesthetic, which is, if you do not accurately depict evil, then your redemption has no power in your story. Yep. If I'm going to read a story and it's like a 1970s TV villain, right? I'm not going to believe it. It's not going to impact me at all. But if I see the evil that's real and it's exposed to me, then that redemption has power. And so in order to show the true logical consequences of these ideas in the college, I have to have the accurate language, and I have to show the accuracy of some of the evil they're engaged in. Now, I don't get pornographic, I don't exploit, but I do deal with some of these things, because if you have students who are protesting and you're just saying, whatever, they're cussing them out or something like that, or just, gosh darn it, get out of here, it doesn't show that the hatred that is in these kids' hearts. Yeah, and it's the F word is an expression of the hatred that leads to violence. And that's my purpose for putting it in there. But even though I still tried to hold back. I didn't try to be excessive about it. Right. But if you're offended by that stuff, then this novel wouldn't be for you. However, my argument is, if you don't accurately depict evil, like the Bible accurately depicts evil, everything from gang rape to genocide, it accurately depicts it. If you don't do that, then you are avoiding reality, and your understanding of the gospel has no impact. It has no power, because you can't face evil. We must face evil and expose it for what it is. That's what Philippians says. We must expose their evil deeds so that it will be evident to all.
Well, and even, and again, it's like we recognize that challenge of showing people what's really going on. And let's be honest, the media loves to whitewash. I mean, what we saw out in Seattle, the autonomous zone a couple of years ago, right? The media loves to portray this as this like nice little hippie commune where everybody's grooving on their acoustic guitars and they're just looking for freedom, and the whole idea that like Antifa rioters would be saying, "Oh drat," or even, the very notion. Readers need to understand. Look, you want to send your kid to such and such big university, figure on them having sex week there, which is a giant orgy taking place with a lot of. This is Sodom and Gomorrah kind of stuff here.
Yeah,
and you can't tell that story and have them just, giving each other side hugs.
Just sort of ignoring it, or just saying, oh, they went to some class about sexuality. It's like, no, I literally drew all the class names that I have for that week from actual real sex weeks and by the way, it started at Yale. It didn't start in some obscure whatever. It's in all the major Ivy League universities and such. So but again, so I just want people to be aware, it's rated R in some ways, but I don't, more for the language, not so much for, I try to avoid the explicit descriptions, but there's a lot of apply because there's a lot of immorality going on there.
Right.
And people need to see that reality to some degree. But if you don't like that, if you can't handle it, then that's fine. It's not for everyone. Just like, I guess, if some Christians can't read Ezekiel chapter 16 or Ezekiel chapter 23, because if you do, it talks a lot about a lot of freaky sexual stuff, and it ain't just describing history. It's actually imagery and imagination used to describe the spiritual apostasy of Israel and Judah. And it uses sexual terms. It uses grotesque sexual terms as well as violent terms. Yeah. And so if you can't read that, I get it. That's fine,
Yeah, and that, it's interesting. I did my doctoral work in Ezekiel. And at one point, even I remember preaching a sermon on Ezekiel 16, and I was asked by somebody, now, how are you going to handle that? How's that scripture reading going to work? Covenant worship in Reformed churches, young children present. And I actually said, look, I realize what we're getting at, and I'm just a guest minister here. I'm a professor, so I don't know this congregation intimately like your home pastor was, but I ended up reading the end of the chapter and saying, look, you need to read this. I'm not going to read it publicly because I don't want to, I don't want you to have to go home and have a conversation with your kids you're not ready to have. Yeah. But you've got to understand how heavy this is so that the gospel at the end of chapter 16 has that beauty, has that richness. No, you're absolutely right. And don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that I think what you just said is great. Is a great counter, or not counter, but just a great balance in that I'm definitely not saying that we should force this on people who are not prepared for it and children and all that kind of stuff for sure. Absolutely not. Right. So thank you for that balance. No, you're right. My pleasure. And that is, it's a hard thing to do. I mean, I as I was reading even this book, I was sort of, I wonder if I was feeling the angst you must have been feeling. I mean, here's a brother, loves God's word, wants to honor him, wants to follow the language of avoiding corrupting talk from Ephesians, and yet, you don't have and I should say to our listeners, look, this is a good debate to have, but that's not really what we're doing here. I'm not trying to just neither of us is trying to just make an excuse for this. Some people are going to understand and feel more comfortable with seeing how this realism is being used in this way more easily than others. Hey, we'll give them their time, that people just need to sort that one out. But as it relates to this, here is an effort to show what is truly being said by those kind of people. You don't have, I don't think you have Officer Van Til speaking in that way. You don't have the Christian characters carrying themselves that way, with the idea that they are the ones who are seeking to honor Christ with their speech, seeking to honor Christ with their thinking, right? It's in that sense, it is across the board a very realistic portrayal.
However, in line with that realism, this is another reason why, my stories are not going to be bad Christian art, because my Christians have sins. I deal with one of the biggest sins in the church that is not dealt with out of for whatever reason, and that's masturbation. And I deal with that in the novel. I don't describe it explicitly, but I do relate. It's part of the story, and it's part of the weakness of a Christian's faith that leads to making him susceptible to the very world around him, right? And that's part of the whole package, because the atheists aren't all bad people and the Christians aren't all good people. I try to show the best version of all sides, but also all sides are human, and therefore all sides have some sins. All sides have something that they're hiding or something that haunts them. That's the nature of storytelling. And so I do that in my stories as well. My Christian characters have flaws that they're struggling with as well in their life. But the bottom line is that it's the context that is the most important. And it's fair enough to know a little, to want to know in advance, okay, if he's dealing with all this evil, but does his story, offer hope? Does it offer redemption? And yes, it does. I never address evil from a purely exploitative sense or a desire to just, show the excessiveness of sin. My goal is always that of the Bibles. I show the sin in order to show the power of redemption and how that you can be pulled out of that and how you can be forgiven. And so, yes, my stories do. But do they all end with people getting saved in churches, being led in the sinner's prayer by a pastor? No. In fact, some people don't get saved. Some get harder in my stories, kind of like the Bible, right? Where some people get harder, some people open up, but they don't open up all the way. They just open up a little bit more. But that's pointing in that direction towards redemption as well. And so I try to have the realism of that real world in there as well. Even though I do have, like I say, I do have the redemption that is offered, but it's not always taken by most people, actually.
Yeah. Well, and you're not alone. I mean, I don't really consider this a spoiler, but I mean, a lot of people get to the end of the Chronicles of Narnia and find out it wasn't really a happy ending for Susan. She's no longer a friend of Narnia, Peter says, and that's just reality. Yeah, it's a sad thing, but if I could maybe one last thing as we bring this to a close. I do think of how the Reformed tradition in particular, but the Puritans often use this kind of dialogical form for a lot of theological treatises. I think of The Marrow of Modern Divinity is a book that was illustrating, the issues of antinomianism and neonomianism and the gospel and the law, and it was set in. Admittedly, it's not really a plot-driven story, but it was a dialogue-driven one. And I'm struck that there's precedent for conveying the truth of our redemption, the truth of Christianity, in a storytelling mode. Maybe just a way to end is what. Even if that's not the exact thing that all our books need to go back to dialogues, although catechisms and those things are very effective, but what advice do you have, not just for writers becoming more theological, but what advice do you have for teachers and preachers, even about how they might be able to better utilize storytelling in their own writing and in their own teaching?
Wow. Yeah. Well, I definitely think that it is, storytelling is you could call it a technique or a mode of communication that can be applied to any communication. People tend to think of it as no, that storyteller is a guy who sits there and tells stories or who writes novels, but it's like no. In fact, storytelling has been powerfully used in legal theory now. Unfortunately, it's been controlled by the postmodern worldview that reduces all truth to narratives, and therefore the best narrative wins. But there's some truth to that, isn't there? Yeah, so you do have to learn how to embody your legal arguments in a good narrative that's going to touch the heart of the jury or whatever, right? And so I do think it applies to everything, and certainly to preachers and teachers. How to do that? Well, that can be complex, because I also know that there's much in the modern church where some pastors that's all they do is sit there and tell funny and cute stories, and they don't really go deep, and so that can become a very weak and manipulative form as well. But I guess I would
when storytelling eclipses exposition. That's one thing. At
least in a sermon, right? Because that's the other thing is we have to acknowledge that every different communication is a different kind and requires a different emphasis. And so I'm not against the strict exposition and such from a sermon, but I don't believe a movie should be a sermon, because that's what reduces into propaganda, and that's what rings. It will not ring true the complexities and ambiguities of reality. It's being able to accurately depict that in your story that draws people to trust you. And if you're being propagandistic, they're going to smell it out eventually if it's not obvious. But but nevertheless, so how to apply that? Yeah, honestly, that's a really good question. I'm not entirely sure, since I've not been a preacher or taught too many classes. I've taught I've done a lot of didactic teaching, but I think just in my later part of life, I've just oriented myself more towards my novels and storytelling. But certainly, I think when I've heard a good sermon, where they start out telling a good story and it's entertaining, but it does embody the ultimate meaning or message that they're going to talk about. That's one good way of doing it, because that story is what helps you get the point right up start. And then when they go into the exegesis, or when they go into the more propositional side of things, it gives you a foundation that you can understand the propositions better, because I think that's what it is. Abstraction is the thing that a lot of people have a hard time with. Some of us love abstraction and we can get along with it fine, but a lot of people don't, and it makes it non-applicable in their minds or their hearts. But if you give them a story, that dramatizes that meaning or whatever message you're trying to communicate, that will help cement it into their minds or their hearts or whatever they're connecting with, so that when they hear the propositional a point, it'll help them understand it better.
Absolutely.
That's where I see the value of it.
We
for sure.
I think how often we get on young preachers here at Mid-America about use of illustration, and really a good illustration is sort of filling out the details of something abstract. And you do find that even without a full-blown, let's be honest, there are some very liberal kinds of Protestant preaching styles that are just sort of this storytelling with a sort of social justice plot line. I mean, I've heard some of these homilies that make me want to vomit. Yeah. But there is a way to use illustration. Well, and it's not even a way to. Illustration helps to fill things out, even on a firmly grounded expository preaching style.
And look, I'm no homiletics, pastor or teacher, whatever. Sure. But I will say this, next time, you're going to give a sermon on some Old Testament passage, consider just reading the entire story, just because sometimes, they don't want to go through all that because it takes up a lot of time, and they'll hit the high points or something, and then they'll
to the kernel, get rid of the husk. Yeah. Oh wait, that's exactly. Boltman. That's Boltman.
Yeah, exactly. So don't do just literally read that whole story to start with. And even if it takes 5 minutes or whatever, I don't know, some of these Old Testament stories can be long, maybe it's the story of David or something. I don't know. I've often wondered, even in my own church, we're like, it would be cool if they did what the original church did, was you just would read the letter to the church and that was it. I'm like, that would be cool even,
Right.
But
right.
whatever.
Oh, wow. Brian, thank you so much. You have just given us a great amount of time, a wonderful, edifying conversation. You've challenged us to think. You have shared some of your own thoughts, the way you've worked your own craft. This has been really an enjoyable conversation we've been able to have, and thanks for joining us. And I just pray rich blessings in your ongoing writing, your ongoing art, your ongoing creativity, and just praying even that this does enable people not only to see Christ-honoring art, God-honoring art in play, but to see how compelling is the truth of God's Word. So thank you, brother.
Thanks for having me.
Next time on MarsCast, Dr. Compton engages with author Richard Coffeen, a PCA pastor in the Chicago metro area. He wrote a very intriguing science fiction novel, which also, like Godawa's work, draws on narrative storytelling and apologetics. I guess pun intended, but this Out of This World podcast looks at missionaries in outer space, opening worlds for sharing the gospel, and a pastoral theology of artificial intelligence? If you enjoyed this episode of MarsCast, please consider subscribing and telling others who may be interested. Your support allows us to produce engaging content and build a thoughtful community of lifelong learners and practitioners. I'm Jared Luchabor signing off for now. See you on the next episode of MarsCast.